Let's make sure everybody is muted. All right. So thanks for coming today, everybody. Today we have Teresa Baraza. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
Let's see here. Teresa is a PhD candidate in the Hasenmueller Lab from SLU, and which does a lot of work researching Deer Creek here on site. All right. And so thank you for doing this today, Teresa, for us. And I just heard that you are in Spain.
I am.
So thank you for taking the time out of your trip. And I know it's very early in the morning for you, or very late in the afternoon.
It's late in the afternoon.
Late
yeah.
in the afternoon.
Well, it's 5 p.m. It's not too late.
Okay. Well, thank you again for doing it. And if you wouldn't mind giving us a brief introduction of yourself, and you can go ahead and start.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. As James said, I'm in Spain because I'm from Spain. I'm actually an international student at SLU. And like James said, I am working with Liz Hasenmueller in her geochemistry and hydrology lab. And today I'm going to be talking about one of my PhD projects that is focused on quantifying microplastic debris sourcing and transport for Karst Aquifer. And this project was partially funded by the National Cave and Karst Research Institute and the Cave Research Foundation. So before I dive into the research project itself, I'm going to present a little bit of background so everyone's on the same page. And the first concept we need to talk about are microplastics. So microplastics are plastic particles that are about less than 5 millimeters in size. And they can be classified either as primary microplastics or secondary microplastics. Primary microplastics are those plastics that are already made to be small, such as microbeads, nurdles, and fibers. And down here, we see a picture of a fiber. And secondary microplastics are those plastics that are formed by the degradation of larger pieces of plastic. And we see a picture here of a few fragments found in a beach. And the reason why we care about the presence of microplastics in the environment is because one of the reasons why plastic is such a great material is because it's very durable. So once it is found in the environment, it takes a very, very long time to degrade, and it's very hard to degrade. So it remains in the environment for long periods of time. And in particular, microplastics, since they are so small, they're also very easy to transport and very easily ingested by wildlife. And once they are ingested by wildlife, they can cause several health issues, both physical, such as organ damage, intestinal blockage, and suffocation, as well as toxicity and endocrine disruption due to compounds that can travel adsorb to the surface of the plastic, such as heavy metals and organic compounds. And here we see some examples of some microorganisms that have ingested plastic that is highlighted in this bright green color. So microplastics are classified as emerging contaminants because they were discovered relatively easily in the Sargasso Sea. And in fact, historically, microplastic research has largely focused on marine environments. And here we see a couple examples of studies done in marine environments. This one focused on microplastic concentrations in the open ocean, and this one focused on microplastic concentrations in different beaches across the globe. However, more recently, there has been more and more research being done in surface freshwater environments, such as rivers and lakes. And here we're looking at a picture of a river in Albania from a report published in 2011, where it is very obvious that plastic pollution is an issue. In this case, most of these, well, all of these visible pieces of plastic are macroplastics, but wherever there's macroplastics, there's very likely microplastics as well. We just can't see them because they're very small. And what studies have found is that generally freshwater systems and continental freshwater systems typically have even more plastic than marine environments. And this makes sense because plastic is used and discarded mostly on land, so it's not terribly surprising. However, what about microplastics in groundwater? So in 2019, there was a report that was published that suggested for the potential of microplastics to contaminate groundwater. And this report suggested a couple pathways that these plastics could be reaching the groundwater through. And we see a couple examples here. This first example, where you're looking at a losing stream located over an aquifer. And the losing stream, the water coming from the losing stream percolates through the bedrock, through the soil and through the bedrock into the groundwater. And the water coming from the surface feature could also be bringing plastics into the aquifer, to the groundwater. And this is just another example of an injection well where water that's used on the surface is injected into the groundwater, potentially also bringing plastic. However, as I mentioned, this was just a report that suggested conceptually 4 different pathways that plastics could take to reach groundwater. But so far, to our knowledge, only one study has been published that has looked at microplastics in karst groundwater, in this case, looking at physical water samples. This study was performed in Illinois by Pano et al. In 2019. And what they found was a positive correlation between plastic concentration and other contaminants such as phosphates. So in this study, authors suggested that both plastic and these contaminants, like phosphates, could have a common source, in this case, septic systems. However, this study was only performed under base flow conditions, and it had a limited amount of samples. So there's still a lot of that is not known about plastic contamination in groundwater. So this study, again, I mentioned it was performed in a karst landscape, which is similar to where my study is located. So I'm going to very briefly introduce what karst is. So karst aquifers are aquifers that are hosted by soluble rocks, such as limestones. And this characteristic that the rock has, it generates the different conduits due to the dissolution of the bedrock. And that's what we see underground. So some of this diagram shows some of the features of a karst aquifer, where we see caves underground, and on the surface we can see things such as sinkholes and limestone pavements and sinking streams. And this very unique architecture causes the presence of 2 very different types of flow in karst aquifers, where we see very fast flow that occurs through this dissolution features in conduits, as well as a slower, more diffuse flow that happens through the porosity of the rock. And in addition to that, this unique architecture also causes a very high connectivity between the surface and the subsurface in karst aquifers. And what this causes relative to contaminant transport is that karst aquifers are in fact very susceptible to surface contamination. So this example right here is a diagram that shows how road salt contamination happens in karst aquifers. So we have on the surface a road salt truck that is putting salt down on the road. And once that salt is dissolved, it can be very easily transported into the subsurface through a sinkhole and transported through conduits in a very fast way. But it can also percolate through the soil, through the bedrock, and reach the groundwater much more slowly. So as you can see, this different flow paths, the different pathways that contaminants can take into and through karst systems makes contaminant transport a very important topic to investigate. And that includes microplastics. So to wrap up the introduction, as I mentioned, microplastic pollution in groundwater is still largely understudied, and there's still not a very clear evidence of what the source and the pathways are for microplastics in groundwater. And in addition to that, as I mentioned, the study was performed under baseflow conditions. So we don't really know how plastics are being transported through groundwater under high flow conditions. And in the specific case of karst, karst caves very often host very fragile ecosystems. For example, here in Missouri, we have the ozark cavefish and the grotosculpin, which are both endangered species. So understanding how microplastics are transported through karstic caves is very important to kind of understand if and how this type of contaminants are a significant threat to these ecosystems. And this is where my study comes in, where I'm trying to quantify microplastic debris sources and transport for a karst aquifer or a karstic cave. So that was kind of the introduction. Now let's move on to my specific study. So my study is located at Cliff Cave, which is the second longest cave in St. Louis County with over 1.3 kilometers of surveyed conduits. The cave is located right next to the Mississippi River, south of St. Louis City, right here. And all the water that flows out of the cave flows directly into the Mississippi River. This is a picture of the cave entrance. As you can see, it's a very large cave entrance, but it's gated to both for safety and to protect the ecosystem inside of the cave, including the bats. It is a cave that is developed in Mississippi and St. Louis limestone. Previous studies performed in this area have estimated that in this cave's recharge area, there's about 39 sinkholes per kilometer squared. And here we see a picture of a sinkhole. And this further emphasizes the importance between the connectivity of the surface and the subsurface, because we can treat sinkholes kind of like pipes that are connecting the surface and the subsurface. Now, if we look at a map view of the cave, let's look at the digital elevation model first. So this weird shape that we're looking at here is the cave outline, the surveyed conduits. So the star marks the main entrance where the gate is. And then when you walk into the cave, there's one main conduit that starts very wide and it starts narrowing and narrowing as you walk in. And then it reaches a point where the cave branches out into two separate conduits. And this triangles here are secondary sinkhole entrances that are located on this sinkhole plane. And again, on this digital elevation model, we can see all these dark spots are all sinkholes that are within the recharge area of the cave. Again, that act as this connection feature between the surface and the subsurface. If we look at a satellite image of the area, we see that most of the cave is underneath a forested area with trails where there's park visitors that hike around and ride bikes. But part of the cave and part of the recharge area of the cave is also located in a neighborhood, in an urbanized neighborhood. So this, again, shows how any contaminants, any pollution that could be coming from this more urbanized areas could potentially be entering the cave as well. Another important characteristic that I wanted to emphasize about Cliff Cave is that it has a very fast response to rainfall events. And just for comparison, here we're looking at two pictures. The first one, the left one, is showing the cave under normal base flow conditions, where we see that the water is relatively very low and clear. And the second picture is showing the cave during a flood response. And this is already taken during the falling leg of the flood. So it had already reached the peak and it was already going down. But we can still see how much higher the water is and how much turbid it is. And as we will talk about in a minute, this can potentially have consequences for contaminant transport as well. Now, let's move on to the methods and talk about how I've performed this research. So I performed water quality monitoring and stage monitoring continuously over 11 months or a whole year, pretty much. And I did that by using a water quality monitoring sonde, which is this device here. which is equipped with a bunch of sensors that measure different parameters such as chloride, turbidity, specific conductivity, pH, etc. And these parameters can help us understand how the hydrology of the cave. And we also had a continuous stage monitoring sensor, which also gave us continuous water height measurements, pretty much. And we could convert that into discharges. In addition to the continuous monitoring, I also performed weekly water sampling from the cave entrance from February 2020 to February 2021. And I also performed high frequency sampling during 4 flooding events from September through December 2020. And by high frequency sampling, I mean, I used an auto sampler to take samples every 30 to 40 minutes during a flooding event, so I could have a very good understanding of what was happening throughout the whole flood response. And all of these samples have been analyzed for microplastic content, of course, as well as general ion chemistry, total suspended solids, organic carbon, and isotopes. And very briefly, I wanted to introduce how we look at microplastic content in water, because it's not a very known method. So for microplastic characterization, we take samples in glass bottles like the one we see here. And one very important thing to note is that during microplastic characterization and sampling, it is very important to be very mindful of contamination, because plastic is everywhere, is in the air. Dust is plastic, our clothing shed plastic. So we have to be very careful, and that's why we use an all glass and metal filtration system. And we make sure to rinse all the equipment with DI 3 times and be very mindful of what we're wearing and how much we're moving, etc. So what we do, we filter the water through this filtration device into a paper filter, and then we leave the paper filter to dry for about 2 to 3 days. And then we look at the filter with a microscope and we look for plastic. We actually have a camera in this microscope that allows us to take pictures and measurements of the plastic. And just to get an idea of the scale of this process, the filtration portion of the process can take from 20 to 60 minutes per sample. And counting the samples can take from less than an hour to up to 6 hours, depending on the turbidity of the sample. So as you can see, it's a pretty lengthy process. So let's look at some results here. So what I can claim from my weekly samples, those samples that I was taking every week for a year from the cave entrance, I found plastic in all of them. Microplastic concentration ranged from 2.1 to 49 counts per liter. And most of the plastics I found were fibers. And you can see this in this pie chart. 93% of the plastics I found were microplastic fibers. And most of them were clear, as you can see here, but I also found other colors such as black, blue, red, and other colors. And here you can see some examples of those fibers. So here we see a black fiber, a clear fiber, and 2 blue fibers. Now, if we look at kind of the temporal distribution of those samples, here, if we're looking at microplastic concentration in this lower section of the plot in both plots across time from March 2020 to February 2021, each of these bars is a sample that I took from the cave. In this top plot, we're looking at microplastic type, and in this lower plot, we're looking at microplastic color. And this top axis on the plots is showing precipitation and daily discharge. So if you look at the temporal distribution of the concentration of plastic over time, there seems to be some higher levels that occur in the spring/summer months. But other than that, we're still working on figuring out if there's a seasonal trend here. But if you kind of just look at it, there's not very evident trends over time, but we're still working on looking for statistical trends in this data set. However, I do want to emphasize a very important trend that I found that relates microplastics with some of the parameters that I looked, water quality parameters that I looked in the cave. So, and what I want to emphasize is the correlation between microplastic and stage and microplastic and turbidity. And as you can see in both cases, we're seeing a positive correlation, which is also statistically significant, which is telling us basically that we're seeing more plastic whenever we see a higher stage and more sediment being transported in the cave, which, as I mentioned earlier, happens whenever we see a flood event. So this results here are indeed showing us that whenever there's a flood response, we are also seeing whenever there's an increase in sediment transport, we're also seeing an increase in microplastic transport in the cave. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the methods, we're very interested in understanding how microplastic transport happens during this live flow events. And therefore we sampled floor flooding events at high frequency to see what was happening throughout time during that hydrograph. And these are the data I'm going to show now. So each of these 4 plots is showing discharge over time with a gray line. And the red line with the dots are microplastic concentrations over time. So this is a flood in September. This bigger one is in October, November, and December. And first of all, if you look at all the plots, I want to emphasize that during the flood peaks, there is an increase in plastic, which I already mentioned. We are seeing this increase in plastic whenever there's an increase in stage and sediment transport. And I want to emphasize this flood that happened in October. If you look at the right axis in all the plots, we have the discharge values in liters per second. And this one is the largest flood that we found, that we were able to sample with almost up to 1,600 liters per second, which is a pretty large flood. And we see that during the peak of the flood, the microplastics that we detected went above the 75.6 microplastics per liter level. This is a maximum contaminant level that was suggested by a previous study. So our samples went above that level. And there's no official EPA maximum contaminant level for microplastics yet, because I believe it's under development, but it's such a new topic that the EPA hasn't gotten there yet. But this is a maximum contaminant level that was suggested by a very recent study that I've decided to go off of. So this level that was actually exceeded with one of the floods that I sampled. Another important thing to notice here, and this is an ongoing hypothesis, and I'm currently working on this data analysis and writing up this project, is that the magnitude of the microplastic contamination that I detected wasn't always related to the magnitude of the flood. So as I mentioned, this flood in October was the largest flood that we sampled, and it was also the largest amount of plastic that we found. But if we look at the flood in September, which is this top one, we see that it was relatively small flood compared to the other ones. So discharge didn't reach 25 liters per second compared to the other ones that we have 850 and 1600. However, the amount of plastic that we found, if we compared with the September flood with the November flood, the amount of plastic that we detected in September was higher than the plastic detected in November, even though the flood was much smaller. So keeping that thought in mind, I wanted to kind of look at the different characteristics of the floods and see if there was any important differences. And I realized that the flood in September, which was the first flood that we sampled, and sorry, here I'm looking at precipitation in black and discharge in gray. Precipitation is upside down. The first one in September, happened right after a pretty dry and long period. And the flood in November was a much larger flood, but it happened right after a series of floods and immediately after another flood. So the working hypothesis here is that plastic concentration in the cave might not only depend on the magnitude of the flood. So the flood in October, which was the largest one, if we look at this plot here, where it's just relating stage and plastic, the largest amount of plastic is found in October, which is also the largest stage. The amount of plastic that we're looking at, that we're detecting, might not only be related to the magnitude of the flood, but also to the anteceding flooding that happened right before the flood. So for example, the second largest flood was November. We see that it's the next lowest stage. However, the amount of plastic is very low, potentially because the system was already flushed out by previous floods that happened right before it. And whereas September, which was the smallest flood that we detected, if we look at the x-axis here, it had a relatively higher amount of plastic, potentially because it hadn't been flushed out prior to the occurrence of the flood. And sorry if that explanation was a little all over the place. It's a working hypothesis and we're still working on this, but this is the idea that we're currently working with. Now we're also trying to detect potential plastic sources, and this is also another topic that we're currently working on, and we're planning on looking at microplastic characteristics such as type and color to try to determine potential sources. And we're also planning on looking at different parameters such as organic carbon, optical brighteners, and different water quality parameters that can give us an idea of where the plastic is coming from. But I wanted to wrap up the presentation with kind of a fun idea and hypothesis that we're working with. So this photo here is showing 2 bottles of water that correspond to 2 samples that were taken for the flood in September. This bottle here, you can see that it has kind of a brown hue to it, just from sediment that is in the water. However, this one here, the water is more clear, but it has kind of a blue hue to it. So when I saw the samples, I noticed that and I was surprised. I didn't know why it was blue. So after talking to Liz, my advisor, we came up with the idea that this blue dye could actually be coming from a man-made pond. And we actually went looking for a pond within the recharge area of the cave, and we found one relatively close to the cave in a residential area in a neighborhood, and you can see a picture of it here. And the working hypothesis is that during high flow events, during precipitation events, when it's raining really hard, water from this pond could actually be leaking into the karst because karst is a little leaky anyway. And whenever the water goes into the karst, it's bringing the dye, and that's why we're seeing this blue hue in the cave. But it could also be bringing other things, including plastic. So we are working on trying to determine if this is a valid hypothesis. So in conclusion, I can say that plastics are present in Cliff Cave during all flow regimes. Most of the plastics are fibers, and most of them are clear. Microplastic transport is definitely enhanced during floods, and we're seeing this peak in plastic transport during peak flooding, and which has implications for mitigation strategies. And in addition to that, microplastics might remain stored in the cave during dry periods and be flushed out during floods. And so during wet periods where there's a lot of flooding happening, we might see less plastic being transported in the later floods. But if we're seeing a large or whatever magnitude of a flood that happens after a dry period, we might actually see more plastic than we expect. So I will be taking questions about this project at the end of the presentation, but we're gonna change gears a little bit, and we're gonna going to very briefly talk about plastic pollution and surface freshwater systems in the St. Louis area. And then we're going to switch to Natalie Hernandez, who is another PhD student in my lab. And she's going to talk about her proposed research at Deer Creek, where you all are at. So we just talked about plastic in groundwater, but there's a lot of being done about plastic in surface water as well. And I wanted to very briefly talk about this Mississippi River Plastic Pollution Initiative that is happening right now, and that there was a few events that happened earlier this year in the St. Louis area. And this Mississippi River Plastic Pollution Initiative is it was designed by the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. And their objective is to try to understand, quantify, and minimize plastic pollution in the Mississippi River. And in the month of April, there was several cleanup events that happened in the city. And some of you might have heard about this. And me and some other lab mates actually participated in a cleanup event that was a Cliff Cave Park, which kind of relates to my project as well in some way. But what we did was we walked up and down the Mississippi riverbank and we picked up trash. And while we were doing that, we were also logging it in an app that is called Marine Debris Tracker, which I forgot to put the logo here, but it's a phone app which you can use to log plastic pollution. And the data that is recorded in that app is used by scientists to understand plastic pollution in the Mississippi River and try to find target areas. And St. Louis was actually one of the first target cities that were related to this project, along with other cities like Baton Rouge, closer to the Gulf of Mexico. And here we see a map of the St. Louis area, and this polygon here, it's the limit of the target area that the scientists were interested in understanding plastic pollution. And you, as a citizen scientist, could download the app, walk around the city, go for a walk for 30 minutes, an hour, and pick up the trash, and at the same time log every piece of trash. You could log the type of trash, the brand, the location, etc., and help gather data for those scientists to better understand plastic pollution in the Mississippi. So with that, I'm gonna let Natalie take over, and she's gonna talk about her proposed research at the Deer Creek watershed related to plastic pollution.
Thanks, Teresa. Okay. So like she said, I'm just gonna give an overview of some of the research that I've started a little bit and will be continuing in the next several years, which is focused on microplastic debris transport in urban streams, and Deer Creek is the urban stream system that I'm going to be focused on. So some of this is a little bit like review from what Teresa already talked about, so I won't go too in depth about background. I'm trying to keep this as like a very short, broad overview. But once again, microplastics, which are the focus of my research, are just small plastic particles. Teresa did a good job of mentioning a variety of different sources and some of the ecological implications. But specific to Deer Creek, we have seen, I'm sure, unfortunately, some of you guys have seen plastic items at Deer Creek, especially after really heavy rainfall events that bring them from upstream. So we know that there are these large plastic items at Deer Creek. And again, like Teresa said, where there are macroplastics, there are microplastics, even if they're not visible in the surface water. And then another potential source other than these macroplastic items is fibers that we see in samples. So these are a couple fibers that I've seen in samples from Deer Creek. And fibers like this can sometimes come from synthetic textiles, which is what this figure is showing, from a paper that was looking at different types of textiles and then the fibers that can come off of them. So those are a couple sources that might be relevant at Deer Creek. of these microplastics. And again, we're interested in looking at these for the ecological implications, and also because we're continuing to use plastic, so there's potential for accumulation, and we don't know what the long-term implications of that are. So I'm interested in studying Deer Creek for a couple reasons. So one, here is Deer Creek's watershed next to St. Louis, and you can see it's this white outlined watershed, and it's within this dashed white one that is the River des Peres watershed, which feeds into the Mississippi River. So this gives what we're seeing at Deer Creek implications for its potential transport into the Mississippi River. And then you can also see where the site is along the entire watershed in this inset map. So it's giving implications to the research I'm doing for downstream sites along the entire Mississippi. And this kind of goes along with what Teresa was saying about the Mississippi River Plastic Pollution Initiative, just understanding how plastic pollution is impacting this entire system. And Deer Creek is like a little piece of that along the Mississippi. You can also see that it's near very intensely urbanized areas. So this map, the darker red colors are higher intensity of development. And so we have that in Deer Creek's watershed. And we see this is a photo of a part of Deer Creek with a bridge that goes over it. There's a bridge right by LREC as well. And lots of examples, including in this slide, of areas where there's a lot of pavement and impervious surfaces that impact the creek, visible plastic pollution sometimes. So Deer Creek is facing these problems that kind of come along with being an urbanized system. And so that makes it a good site to study microplastics and understand how microplastics are moving through urban systems and in relation to the larger Mississippi River watershed. So Teresa talked in more detail about this, but just some more pictures again. We filter microplastics onto these filters, and then we can inspect those on the computer and end up with these images like this one. And so currently I'm analyzing water samples from Deer Creek. We've been taking weekly water samples to look for microplastics. And so this is an image of one, and we're kind of continuing that work at Deer Creek. And we also take other geochemical tracers. This is a handheld device that measures optical brighteners, but there's other tracers that we're looking at to understand the sources of water and then potentially sources of plastic, which again is going to be kind of like what Teresa's doing at Cliff Cave, but just with a surface water body. And so I presented some of this at a previous one of these volunteer enrichment activities earlier this spring. I did some preliminary research looking at a storm event at Deer Creek. So I don't have a lot of results because I know a lot of you guys have seen this already. But essentially, I collected some water samples throughout a storm event and then was counting microplastics in them. And this is the kind of main result of, you can see the discharge of the event, and then the microplastic concentrations are these little diamonds. And there's a peak of microplastics just after the peak of discharge. I didn't have samples throughout the entire event. It was just a few samples throughout it. But we did see the same kind of trend that Teresa has seen, where there's higher levels of microplastics as the storm event is going on. And this was also in a smaller storm event. So these pictures on the right are from the storm event. And you can see the water gets high, but a lot of you have probably seen Deer Creek at really, really high flow, and it can get a lot more dramatic in this. So one of the things that we're hoping to do in the future is capture more storm events, and maybe more that are larger flow events, to see how that impacts this trend of higher microplastics. Some other future work, like I said, will continue research on the storm-related microplastic variation using this ISCO, which is near LREC, so you might have seen it. And then I also plan to collect sediment samples along with water samples. and analyze those for microplastics to understand how they might be moving between sediment and water. And these are some spatial sites that I'll be sampling, including LREC, but also upstream and downstream. And then also I will sample biota, probably like a filter feeder like clams or mussels, to understand how they are taking microplastics as well from the water, and look at the differences between these different types of samples, to understand kind of movement of microplastics within Deer Creek, but also how that might relate to transport into the Mississippi River. So thank you. I know that was a lot in a brief overview, but now I think we can take questions for Teresa, and if you have any for me also.
Yeah, so feel free to put your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself.
So for those curious about the marine debris tracker app, someone asked and I dropped the link in the chat. And you can download that app and do it whenever you want. But Natalie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the data collection period for that specific project is already passed, right?
Yeah, I'm sure if Liz wanted to, she could give more details about this, but they were doing a project where they were releasing these plastic bottle tags into the Mississippi River at different cities to try and see how they're moving through the river. And that was done in April. There was one release from St. Louis. So they were trying to collect a bunch of data in April surrounding the launch of that project, essentially. So that's what those sites on the map Teresa showed were for. But you can do this year round, anytime and any location. It's like a global data set as well. It's not just being used for this project. So if you're interested, yeah, I would check out that website. And they also have like maps of where data has been collected and you can look through all of it. It's pretty cool.
So I see a question in the chat. Martha is asking, are microplastics in our drinking water? Do most of the clothing fibers in streams come from laundry water? Natalie, we can both answer this type of questions if that's okay. There have been studies that have looked at drinking water, correct? And I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that we have found plastic in tap water ourselves. I can't remember the results from those studies that were official, but I can say that we find plastic in tap water in our lab. So yes, that is very likely that there's plastic in drinking water. However, it's not at dangerous concentrations. Of course, it's not. And we don't really know how plastic affects human health yet. There's a lot of research being done about that right now. But there's also plastic in our food. I know there has been research that have found plastic in meat and other types of products that we consume from the grocery store. Like if you buy frozen sausages and you rip them from the styrofoam tray, you're probably taking some of that styrofoam and cooking it too. So it's not rare. And Martha also asked, do most of the clothing fibers in streams come from laundry water? I'm not sure if I can say most of them do, but definitely a lot of them do. So there's also a lot of research being done focused on quantifying how much plastic comes from our laundry and our dryers too. And there has been research that has been done with just as we have those lint things in dryers where they collect all the lint coming from the dryer. There's also a prototype of filter that could be installed in washing machines that would filter water before it goes down the drain, so it could collect some of this plastic that's being released from clothing. So definitely the washing machine really makes our clothing shed. And I know that there's also studies that looked at different types of detergents and how they are cause abrasion to clothing. So powdered laundry detergent might be more abrasive for clothes compared to liquid detergent. So there's definitely a lot of research being done on that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Natalie.
Not really. That was a good answer.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, there are microplastics in drinking water. There have been like studies that try to estimate how much we drink a year. So there is that research out there if you're interested in it.
Didn't you say once that it's about the size of a credit card or something like that?
I think that, so that's something that I want to say World Wildlife Fund has like an advertisement that has a credit card and it's like, you're eating this every year. And that's supposed to be the combination of drinking and eating, like how much plastic you're ingesting. I don't know how exact that is. This study that I'm thinking of, it estimated amounts for like a certain age range of people, and they're just basing it on existing research of contamination, like you said, in like different meat products and things like that. And then also in water. The only thing I really remember is that if you drink bottled water, like in plastic bottles, that increases the amount kind of dramatically of how much you're getting every year. But yeah, like Teresa said, it's not anything that we should be super concerned about at the moment. And then about the clothing fibers, I think that the two main things I can think of is one, that they come from laundry water, and two, that sometimes they could just shed in the air off of what you're wearing. But I think that that's a much smaller source. I'm not sure about that, but I think that that's smaller. And so related to that, the next question was, have you found any orange fibers while sampling? Because you guys wear the orange shirts. No, I have not seen any orange fibers. I've seen a lot of blue, clear, black, and I think I've seen a red fiber. I had it on one of the slides. I'll let you know if I see a lot of orange fibers. I have a feeling though that they're not shedding enough off of your clothes and like the ambient air for that to be a big thing. But
and to be truthful, most people are probably taking home their orange shirts and washing them, so they're potentially ending up somewhere else.
Somewhere else, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. Good question though.
Also, since you mentioned dryers, I wonder if there should be something more done to like for filtering dryer vents as well, because I mean, if you go out to the outside dryer vent outside your house, you know, all those fibers are like collecting on that exit there. So
yeah, that's actually a good research idea. Like you could sample the air and the soil around and away from a dryer vent, and I'm 100% sure there's more plastic closer to the vent, because I'm cleaning my vents all the time because there's lint that goes through it. So definitely, for sure. And like I said, this is my opinion, but something like a filter for a washing machine should be installed in all washing machines. And I know I believe there are some that I already have it, but I might be wrong. But there's definitely research being done to potentially come up with a design of a filter that could be installed in a washing machine that with low maintenance, that would just be part of the washing machine. I see another question. Linda asks, are there studies focusing on the effect of microplastics in organisms? Yes, there are. There are a lot of research groups all over the world looking into this. And yeah, there is. I mentioned towards the very beginning of my presentation that microplastics can cause both physical health issues such as suffocation and organ damage, etc., as well as toxicity. So there's kind of two branches of this type of research where people are looking at how plastics are physically affecting organisms since they are not easily digested or degraded, and how toxic compounds that are transported on the surface of the plastic are also affecting organisms. So there's research that has proven that plastic is actually causing or compounds that are transported with plastic cause things like endocrine disruption in, I believe, fish. And I think Natalie has read more than me, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would say is a lot of this research is in kind of originally, it's the same thing as with the general concentrations. Originally, a lot of it was on marine organisms, and then there's also freshwater organisms, and then like terrestrial things, like there's research on earthworms and things like that. Basically, it's like decreasing through each of those. So there's a lot of information about different marine species. Also less, but still a lot about freshwater organisms, and then even less about things that are living on land. But that's an area where I think they're increasing research constantly. So there's more and more.
Has there ever been any research into like landfills and them like leaching into the bedrock and into the karst systems, things like that?
Yeah, so not specifically into karst systems, but there are studies both in landfills as well as just agricultural fields where they use sludge as fertilizer, because that sludge is coming from, wastewater plants and where they're treating wastewater. So yeah, that's also being studied, and I'm not 100% sure about the landfills. I know for sure I've read papers focused on agricultural settings where they use sludge as fertilizer. Natalie, have you read anything?
No, I haven't seen anything about like sampling around landfills either, but maybe there's something.
All right. Well, does anybody have any final questions? All right. If not, Teresa, Natalie, thank you so much. Do you guys have any final thoughts on this at all that you want us to know about? Oh, it looks like we have one more question popping in. Have you contacted the owners of the pond near Cliff Cave?
No, I have not. As we investigate the potential of that pond leaking into the karst, we will think about doing that. I'm not sure if it would be very relevant to do, and we also have samples from the ponds themselves to see if there's any plastic in the water, but no, we haven't contacted the owners yet. But it's also a gated community, and I'm not sure who I would contact because it's like a community pond, if that makes sense. And just to wrap up, if there's any additional questions, feel free to contact me or Natalie, and Natalie will be around a lot. So if you see her, I'm sure you can stop her and chat with her. I'm offering your time, Natalie.
Yeah, no, definitely you can.
Well, awesome. Thank you both. And we'll be seeing you soon.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.
Bye.